Well, welcome. I'm Susan Bailey. I'm Executive Director here at 108 Contemporary, and I'd love to welcome you to our first in-person event in 16 months. So, yay! We're very excited to be back in person, and really glad to have everyone here in the gallery amongst all these wonderful instruments in the exhibition. Welcome also to those of you who are joining us via Facebook tonight. So whether you're in person or virtual, welcome. Tonight's talk by Rob Katz is presented in connection with the exhibition A Luthier's Tale, the craft of string instruments that is all around us. Curated by Tulsa luthier Benjamin Liggett, just walking the door. This exhibition will continue through September 19th here in the gallery. We are extremely grateful to them for all of this hard work on this exhibition. But before introducing tonight's speaker, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors who have made this exhibition and its related programming possible. A Luthier's Tale is sponsored by Oklahoma Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Kinder Morgan Foundation, the Flint Family Foundation, the Cecil and Virgie Burton Foundation, Bert Holmes, and Jean Ann Bowser. I'd also like to give a shout out to Lou Lynch of the Tulsa Violin Shop, who was in contact with the classical makers in the exhibition and fundraised to bring many of those makers to Tulsa. I'm sorry. Something talking. Just never know. Thanks also to the committee of 108 board members and community members who worked for several years to bring this exhibition to life. It was originally supposed to happen last summer, and we all know, that everything changed in 2020, so we're very glad to have the exhibition on display now. Tonight's speaker was a very important part of the exhibitions committee. We're thankful for his participation in that role. And then, of course, tonight we have him here as a speaker for this wonderful program. And Rob is probably familiar to many of you because of his role in the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra. He has played the double bass for TSO since 2005. And he also writes the concert program annotations. However, you may not be as familiar with his wealth of expertise about musicology. Rob received his Bachelor of Music from Southern Illinois University, his Master of Music and Music Theory from the University of Tulsa, and his PhD in Historical Musicology from the University of Texas. He has presented about music from around the world, including the flamenco music of Spain, Sufi music of Pakistan, and classical music of Northern India. Tonight, we will be discussing the African origins of the American banjo. So please welcome Rob Katz.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody for showing up tonight. It's nice to know I have lots of friends and future friends. I'm really excited about this presentation because I was not any kind of expert in banjo, but it was one of the requests of the committee that I do a presentation on banjo, since we actually have a couple of nights. I thought it fit well because I also teach American popular music. This was a great chance for me to sort of delve into the connection between the history of the banjo and traditions associated with American. So let me just start out by asking a question, and that is, what comes to mind when you think of a banjo? Feel free to just.
Folk music. Folk music.
Folk music, okay.
Bluegrass.
Bluegrass.
Happy.
Happy. Yeah, a lot of people feel like the sound of the banjo is kind of happy. It's hard to feel sad. Okay. And those are really quite common associations: folk music, country music, bluegrass, and I was thinking somebody might say dueling banjos. You were thinking that, but you were too shy to say.
I was happy.
Yeah, right. So, one of the things that's connected sort of to the notion of a banjo is the idea of stereotypes. Right? There are stereotypes that appear connected to the banjo throughout its history. And obviously, we are in the 21st century, and the stereotypes that we associate with the banjo are 21st century stereotypes. And they tend to be based on our experiences of the banjo as kind of music of white rural people. And so that's just sort of a beginning, an introduction into what the idea of what the history is, and where did all this come from in terms of what the banjo is all about. So let me sort of just launch in. I've got an introduction, and then Jen will move the slides as I progress through. We're not quite there. She's really good. So, the banjo has often been called the most American musical instrument. This description, while seemingly simple and straightforward, is deceptively complicated and requires significant understanding and clarification. The question of what exactly makes something American is problematic, regardless of the subject one's considering, whether you're talking about music or art or even personal identity. So, the identification of the banjo as the quintessential American instrument is no less challenging than later. The banjo is most obviously American because it's something that grew out of a set of circumstances that are characteristic of the history, culture, and geography of the United States. Banjos, in the sense of the instrument most of us have seen, a pair of which are an American invention. But as most philosophers will tell you, nothing comes from nothing. The American banjo didn't just appear, it's the result of a variety of sources and influences, and it's this diverse set of sources and the complex interaction that resulted in the instrument that we know today. The history and tracing of lineage also provides the basis for understanding not just what makes the banjo an American creation, but what is so profoundly and perhaps disturbingly American. In many ways, the story of the banjo is a story of the American experience. It's an immigrant story, it's an entrepreneurial story, it's a story of inventive imagination and musical exploration, a story of stereotypes and misconceptions. Perhaps most essentially, it's a slavery story. Today, I'd like to explore the banjo both as a physical object, that is, as a musical instrument, and as a representation, a symbol of cultural experience, because all objects have meanings beyond their obviously functional purpose. Let me start by saying that one could say there is no such thing as the banjo. This might sound silly or obtuse, but even at this moment in time, the variety of types of instruments being produced under the name or description of the banjo is remarkably diverse. This, of course, has always been the case. Banjos can have 4 strings, 5 strings, 6 strings, even 12 strings. They can have fretted or unfretted necks. And they can use gut, metal, or nylon strings. They can have long necks or short necks. They can have simple wooden frames with backs or elaborate metal reinforced ones with wooden resonators attached. They can be strummed with a pick, played with finger picks, or played in the old style claw hammer technique. The banjo has no singular antecedent. It's an adaptation of a variety of similarly constructed and played instruments that originated in Western Sub-Saharan Africa, places like the Gambia and Senegal. The various tribal people from this region played instruments that were built from calabash and gourd bodies, wooden necks using animal hair for the strings, usually 1 to 3 strings. The gourds would be cut open, and opening covered with an animal skin fixed to the gourd, creating a resonator that was at once a chordophone, which is the sort of technical word for a string instrument, and a membranophone, or drum. If you look at modern and banjos, they actually do look exactly like a drum. So, and it's this unique duality that defines both the banjo and its African antecedents. So the banjo is a musical instrument succinctly created by enslaved African people, transported to the New World, and reminiscent of similar instruments found throughout the regions of West Africa, where these people lived. So, in my study of the banjo, I was sort of forced to deal with understanding the history of the slave trade. And where do these people come from? How do they get to the various parts of the Western Hemisphere? Which people in particular provided the direct antecedents to the banjo as we know it. So next slide, I found a website which, yes, shows graphically the flow of slave ships from Africa to the New World. And you see as time progresses along this line, the rate of ships moving from east to west dramatically, especially as we move through the 17th century. But if you'll notice in particular, this region here, where the ships go is to the Caribbean. So it only takes 2 minutes to get this 350 minutes of history. This demo actually accounts for 15,000 different slave ships. You can click on each one of these black dots and it'll tell you the name of the ship. People, its point of origin, its see if things are starting to pick up quite intensely as we get to beginning of the 18th century. So we can move on. There we go. So we can see that Western Africa is the source of most of the people who traded as slaves to the New World. And you can see this graph doesn't give you a very precise display of where people from which part of Africa land, but it is definitely from this sort of northwestern portion of Africa, sort of bulging out section where they come to the Caribbean. And if you look at the numbers, this is something that I think a lot of people are sort of not fully aware of. It's going to be a particularly well-informed audience, so forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know, but the United States only received about 307,000 slaves from Africa, whereas the Caribbean, Brazil together received 6 million. So 300,000 is a small proportion. But I don't want to doubt the significance of slave trade as ever in this extended right? So let's go to the next slide. So this is a depiction of this sort of bulging section of Africa. And you can see places like the Gambia, which is this really kind of tiny country that's completely surrounded by Senegal. So you'll see this word Senegambia because the country names, the divisions, the separations are artificial, right? That's all national boundaries. These are tribal regions that are controlled. But it's in this region that we find lots of instruments that seem to be the antecedents to the banjo, right? Including places like Mali, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau. So this is a focus because these are the people who are coming to the Caribbean. And it's their experience in Africa that's going to lead to what happens when we get to. So next slide. Okay. So the types of instruments that we find in northwestern Africa are referred to in sort of the musicological terms as spiked lutes, right? Every instrument you see in here is a lute, right? In technical terms, right? So these are string instruments where the strings are stretched across the body that's typically a resonating hollow space and attached to a neck. So we call those lutes. And that's why this exhibit is called a luthier's tale because it encompasses all types of string instruments that have a similar type of construction. There's a very wide variety. People might say, well, how can a violin, a banjo, and an electric guitar be played? Organologically, which is the sort of technical term to study musical instruments, they actually derive from the same source. So spiked lutes are these kinds of instruments that we see that date back to antiquity. Right? They probably originated in Mesopotamia thousands of years, and then spread to other parts of the world, to Arabia, to Northern Africa, and spread through Africa, particularly through the spread of Islam and to trade. And so we see instruments that are related to these very ancient instruments that are made of materials that are indigenous to the people in this region. So these spiked lutes are gourds or calabashes. I have to learn the difference between the two. Didn't know the difference. Cool, I know something. So a gourd is something that grows on a vine, right? Kind of like a pumpkin, right? And a calabash grows on a tree. But they're large, hollow fruit. Right? And when you dry them out, they retain their shape. So when you take these boards or these calabashes, cut them in half, and you take a piece of wood, like a long stick, and you stick it through the body of the gourd, you have two options. You can either stick it all the way through so that it protrudes through the other end, or you can stick it part way through. If it goes all the way through, it's called a full spike. And if it only stops in the center of the instrument, it's called a half spike. It's pretty obvious. Okay, so this is from a very authoritative source. He says that research indicates that early gourd banjo, while fundamentally West African in design, was not an exact replica of any known African instrument. Rather, it embodied a synthesis of structural features from one or more African traditions and several additional features which were most likely inspired by Spanish and Portuguese plugins encountered in the Caribbean. Okay? So when somebody says, well, this is the granddad of the banjo, well, that's only in a very limited sense, right? Because the truth of the matter is that the banjo is an invention of the right? It's not exactly one of those instruments, it's influenced by it, but it's something that had to be created anew by people who are familiar with those other instruments, but didn't have those same resources, and were being influenced by a variety of other sources, right? The other important thing, and I'll probably say this again, is that these people coming to the Caribbean as slaves were coming from various parts of Africa. They weren't just Africans in some uniform, singular, homogeneous sense. They all had different tribal associations. They spoke different languages. They had different religious traditions. They had different cultural practices. So our notion of this sort of homogeneous quality of the slaves during the slave trade is a complete misunderstanding of what that social experience was like. And it's a misunderstanding that's reinforced by the slave traders, right? By the people who owned slaves, because they were not interested in what their social and cultural distinctions were. They were much more interested in this property. Right? So they were just something to be paid for, and the difference between one black outfit and another black outfit was only how much work that person, that object could perform. Right? So it's a very dehumanizing process. And as we think about the instrument in those terms, we forget that these are human beings who are creating this instrument in response to the circumstances in which they exist. Right? So it's a really kind of complex thing that's going to happen. Next slide. Okay, so here we see an example of 3 different spiked lutes of West Africa. I don't know if y'all can see very closely. And the original names of the native names of these instruments. And the first one and the third one actually look very similar. Right? And they actually are very similar. These are half spiked lutes. because you can see the stick of the neck actually ends right here. And it serves as an anchor for the strings and for the bridge that holds the strings above the body. That's a very interesting kind of construction. You'll also notice that there are these kind of leather straps on the neck. And these are just round sticks. They're not fret holes the way you think of guitar. Those were the ways that the string lengths were controlled, and that was basically the only tuning that was available in this construction. Right? And in some cases, like in this one, which is called the Aconte, which is viewed by most people who study culture, history of the banjo, as sort of the most direct antecedent to the banjo. It has a short upper string, so I'll call this the top string. And the other strings are longer. And if you look at those two banjos over there, you'll see that there's a fifth string that's shorter than the others. And that is a very early aspect of all banjos that we see in the world. That short string is a drone, right? A drone means that it's not fingering, you don't stop it, it just plays that over.
Are these boards?
Yes, these are boards. Right? This may be part of the board. In some cases, they're hollowed out lines. This one's definitely. And they have animals. Yeah, another question? How many strings? So it varies. Here we have 3. I believe this one has 3 as well. 2 I can't see. They vary, so some instruments have only 1 string. 3 is the most that you'll see on these kind of spike loops. There's another instrument that's called the kora. It's a really beautiful harp-like instrument. It has 21 strings. It's actually played with 2 hands.
Is there any ways of individual attention?
So there's no tuning pegs on there, right? And so there's not really a way to fine tune them. There's just ways to stop them at these various points. So I think I've told you everything. Well, there's a couple of points that I want to make here. Something else you notice. So here, it's difficult to see. I'm sorry about the quality of the image. The bridge is actually fixed to the end of the stick. Here, the bridge sits on the skin, right? And that's called a floating bridge. And that's what we see on banjos. The bridge sits on top of that membrane. It's a plastic or mylar or but it's held in place just by the tension of strings. If I'm going too slow, please feel free to pick up the pace. I can do just talk about stuff. So, all right, let's move on to the next phase in this process. So, something that happens is as we get to the Caribbean, where these people are now landing, making their homes, and in addition to working on plantations, they are performing the kinds of social interactions that people do when they get together. We see the creation of sort of the real antecedent to the American banjo, which is this Caribbean, or what's referred to as a Creole. So Creole refers to the kind of blending of cultures, right? African culture, indigenous culture, white culture. So it's a hybridization. So it's a Creole banjo because we start to see characteristics that it's looking more like the banjo we're accustomed to seeing. Right? Notice the carved head at the top of the neck, where the strings would be. But it's still made of a board. It's still a full spike loop because if you look down here, you can see how the neck extends through the body to the end. I quoted this little bit here. Slaves who reached North America in the 17th century tended to come from the Caribbean because I started to wonder, well, if all of these slaves are coming to the Caribbean, what's the connection with the American band? Right? The Caribbean. does it explain how they become sort of predecessor to what we think of as the American banjo. And so I did a little bit more research, and I found out that in fact, most of the slaves who came to North America, the United States, were actually being imported from the Caribbean. So there really was this direct line. In my mind, there was sort of this gap. There's been quite a bit of research trying to trace the history of movement of slaves during the 17th century. Okay. So this is probably the closest ancestor to the and there's a really interesting development that we discover here about this issue, because the banjo, or the instruments that are the predecessors to the banjo in Africa, had a very specific function in the culture. That they weren't just for entertainment or for dancing. They were for that. But if you know something about many tribal cultures, that dancing and music are usually part of a complex of ritualized behaviors that often connect to important spiritual components of the people's lives. And so we know from documentation that there are these very important figures within the tribes of Western African groups called griots. So I'm familiar with that term. You take my humanities class. But these are, they're not like the medicine men, but they have a very special role. They are charged with sort of being the living memory keepers of the culture. And so they have a really important role in reminding people about their ancestors, about the role of who is going to take leadership roles within their society. And they tell stories. And the recounting of these stories was done as they played on these instruments. So the instruments themselves had a kind of spiritual function. We see this seems to be true in the Caribbean cultures as well. And of course, remember again, we've got this kind of heterogeneous collection of different tribal cultures. And so the slaves who were making these instruments and who were performing these types of rituals, we're having to figure out ways to make it work in these groups who aren't uniform. So it was a real challenge to kind of bring themselves together, even though they had very disparate kinds of cultural origins. Right? Something else that we know is true about the banjo is that, in addition to other types of rituals, that they were probably universally found during funeral. And of course, most cultures, this ritual, this rite of passage into the afterlife is significant, continues to be in those places. And so this funeral use of the banjo relates to these ideas of transition. Right? So we see how this kind of functions to connect what's happening in the common experience of these diverse slaves, right? That everyone is having this experience of a transition into the new world from the old world. They also have to experience what's happening life to the afterlife. And this is also connected to other rituals here of Vodou, which was present in particular, Cuba also. So this is a interesting connection. This instrument is not just pure. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so now we're getting to the United States. This is what you all know. So this is a very famous painting, and it's on the next slide as well, if you want to just. This is called the Old Plantation. And I was going to do a whole section on iconography, but I'm already over time, or I should be in this presentation. But this is one of the oldest representations of slave life in the United States. This painting was done by, people didn't know for sure who the painter was, and sort of attributed to a guy named John Rose, who was a Virginia slaveholder, and that he probably painted this image from people, slaves who worked on his land. And the interesting thing for us is he depicts a banjo. See him down in the right corner. There's also a drummer sitting next to him, and he seems to be accompanying some type of ritual. It's a method behind that. Ritual is already present here. The problem we have is that we don't know what ritual is taking place. We don't know if this is some type of celebration. There seem to be a couple of couples. There's two here, two there.
To me, it looks like a wedding.
So it's very likely the mention of couples should bring that concept to the forefront. And of course, you may be aware that in African American wedding rituals, there's something called jumping the broom ritual. He's not holding a broom, though. It is some type of shaped stick. But it's very possible that this is some variant of the jumping ritual.
What are they holding on the left?
She's holding some type of textile. There's a really interesting article where there's actually a 20th century remake of this painting. It's changed in certain interesting ways. It's really kind of interesting and telling, but I can't get that specific digression that it's in. Go to the next. Okay, so now we can focus a little bit more detail on the musicians here on the left, and particularly the banjo. So this is a type of banjo that is referred to as a plantation, for obvious reasons. And you see that clearly the shape of the body is a gourd. So this is kind of like the Creole banjo. And you can see it's got 4 strings. There are 3 strings attached to the top, and then there's a short string. So again, we see all these elements that kind of trace it back in terms of its lineage, but it has also different features, right? Because it's got pegs that hold the strings in place. It has a carved neck with a flat surface for fingering, no frets though. Right? It's an unfretted banjo, and that's characteristic of the plantation banjo. No frets. The other really interesting thing about this is if you notice the right hand of the banjo, you see the thumb is outstretched and the index. And this is the way those African instruments are played. Thumb hitting those upper strings, which is the drum, and then the index finger striking downward onto the upper strings. Okay? You see that. So he's really taking detail to paint this. I guess he didn't really know how much we appreciate it. Good. The last point I want to make is about these carvings in the bottom. And we see 2 main types of images. One is this kind of star shape. It's got 6 arms to it. And then there's a cross, right? An equilateral cross, sometimes called a square cross. This is not a Christian cross. That this type of cross actually harkens back to African symbolism, right? And it has to do, again, with this idea of crossing between spaces of like the present and the past, the living and the dead. And so this ritual is reinforced once again by the imagery that we see on the instrument itself. This is, again, a kind of playing of music. This is something I feel very strongly about, is a ritual, right? It's a spiritual practice. And the use of the instrument ties the people to their spirituality. This instrument functions in this way very specifically. Okay, next slide. So that's the amount of information that I'm leaving out of this presentation literally fills lots of books. So if this is something that's interesting to you, feel free to contact me. Send me references. But I want to move now into the sort of the Americanization. And the banjo becomes the American instrument that we think of today as a consequence of, in particular, this guy, whose name is Joel Walker, Joe Sweet. He's extremely important in the history of the banjo. He's probably one of the earliest white banjo players to learn directly from black banjoists. He was a rural Virginia, poor growing up, probably intermingled with lots of different people, including servants and slaves. And he becomes proficient, and he starts to play in lots of different venues like services and medicine shows, because that's where banjo players showed up, not like carnival. And so he really begins to sort of popularize the banjo. He develops an incredible reputation. In fact, he goes to England and begins to sell out crowds throughout England. And he's also one who was responsible for spreading the banjo to the British Isles. So you see Irish Celtic musicians playing banjos. That didn't happen before the early 19th century. And Sweden is probably one of the most important figures associated with that importation. Right? He standardizes what's known as the 5-string banjo. Both of those instruments there are 5-string banjos. If you play banjo today, it's probably a 5-string. Right. Another interesting thing about Sweeney is that he usually performed in blackface. Right? And we associate blackface with minstrelsy. It's for a good reason, because minstrelsy was also performed in blackface. We think of him as a minstrel performer, but he wasn't part of the minstrel show, right? Which was this kind of formal theatrical production with multiple components to it, with different characters. But eventually he does become part of the minstrel shows. Because he was a white musician, and he was spreading sort of the gospel of banjo to white people, becomes identified as the creator of the banjo. We know this is incorrect. We know the banjo existed well before this. We just saw a picture from the 17th, 18th century. Banjo. But this begins the sort of transformation, the removal of the banjo from its original slave and plantation culture into sort of the realm of white music and performance. Ironically, it's within the context of them blacking out and mocking, imitating. Something else I learned, which I really wasn't aware of, is that blackface actually originated not as minstrelsy, but performing in blackface. Blackface is a kind of a mask, right? We know masks are common in theater, but in minstrelsy, it takes on this very pernicious kind of racist. Something else to keep in mind is that in the period a decade or two before the beginning of the Civil War, till about 1880, minstrelsy was the most popular form in the United States. That there were minstrel troupes performing all over the country, from coast to coast, and people would flock to see the shows. And this was really the first form of common cultural, popular entertainment experience in the United States, right? It was the television. Everybody saw it, they heard the songs that were being popularized. And of course, it's within the context of the minstrel show that Stephen Foster, probably the greatest early American songwriter, had most of his famous songs before. So we can get into a whole digression about Stephen Foster and his songwriting. It's a fascinating thing. He's amazing, interesting, tragic. But ultimately, what we have in minstrelsy is the denigration of slavery and black culture. Right? This is, extremely unfortunate reality, but nonetheless, something we have to acknowledge. Minstrelsy remains a part of the American entertainment experience. You can see relics and remnants of it even to this very day. Just because people aren't cognizant of the fact that they're doing it doesn't mean that it's not. So, next slide. I got 7:45. Okay. So the next phase is this thing that is referred to as the elevation of the band. And by elevation means that it's taking it out of its poor, rural, slave context and turning it into something different, something higher, something more noble. Right? And so you see descriptions of plantation banjos as primitive, right? Of course, sort of an anthropologist says this notion is not. But we do see modifications to the instrument in place, and the instrument is beginning to take the shape of the modern. So what we see on the left is a plantation banjo, but modified, because now it's got a carved wood body. It's got brackets holding the skin to the circular body, and this beautiful carved fingerboard with also kind of carved, almost violin-like scroll. It's we also see brackets being added, and the more brackets that get added to the instrument, the more sophisticated and complex it seems. Right? And at the time, what people were saying was, well, this complex and interesting instrument is well too sophisticated for black slaves to possibly. So it was a way of sort of creating this separation. This is not the same instrument. This is Sweden's instrument. It's an application. This is not that. That's the instrument. The instrument on the right is it's called a presentation banjo because, well, if you look at it, it's incredibly loud. It's got beautiful inlay of fingerboard. It's got gold frame brackets. This is sort of the extreme version of sophisticated. This banjo was probably built around 1895. So now we're getting into the post-Reconstruction era, moving into the development of new musical types like ragtime. So this is black music in the early 20th century. So the first one you see here is, it's quite offensive, right? This is sheet music that was printed to a song called All Coons Look Alike. If you look at the depiction, it's kind of this parodistic imagery suggesting that this is post-slavery, post-emancipation. Yet the depictions of African Americans is still this kind of ridiculous, absurd, clownish thing. Unfortunately, this is a song that was composed by a man named Ernest Hogan, who was a black composer. And so one of the great paradoxes at the end of the minstrel period in this coon song is that many black musicians participated in writing the music and performing it. And so this is like, how's that even possible? But opportunities were so limited for black performers that minstrel shows that were writing these coon songs, which were incredibly popular, were really just a way to make money successful. In fact, they were very successful. So ragtime is an outgrowth of these coon songs and the use of the banjo. So ragtime music has a direct connection to the banjo. And this is, it's hard for us to imagine today how popular ragtime was sort of the craze of its period. People could not get enough. The thing that makes ragtime really popular is its rhythm, right? It's this idea of syncopation. Syncopation. I can demonstrate. But it's when you play music that emphasizes off the main beat, right? So it's bop, 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 bop. It's the main beat here. So it's got this sense that it really swings, right? It's great, lively dancing. So as ragtime becomes more popular, of course, ragtime is really music that comes out of the African community. We have the music that's being composed by a guy named James Seeger. He's probably one of the most important musicians that most people have ever heard. And he composed ragtime music, especially for dancing, right? And so one of the really, I don't have time to get into all of his other things, but if you want to read about a really interesting life, but he composed music for a couple named Irene and Vernon Castle. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they were dancers, and they're the dancers who popularized something called The foxtrot was another fad that swept the country. It made them incredibly popular. They started dancing schools. They were kind of the Arthur Murray, Arthur Murray, right? You had dance schools all over the country. Well, before Arthur Murray, it was the Castles. And he composed the music for the Castles. And his orchestra consisted of 3, 4, 5 banjos. So the
He's black.
yes, James Regier was black. That's it, black music. The Castles were white, but they recognized that he was the guy who wrote the music. In fact, James Regier was the first black musician to perform for a mixed audience in Carnegie. This is before the first book. So he's a really interesting, incredible person. So the banjo now is part of ragtime, it's part of dance music. Dance music is sweeping the country. And so the banjo is incredibly popular. In fact, the golden age of the banjo in the United States is basically between 1890 right? And literally tens of thousands of banjos were produced and sold all over the country. Right? So another example of influential black music from the early 20th century is Dixieland jazz and jazz in general. And I have a picture here of Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five, one of the most important jazz musicians of all time. And this is his first band that performed and recorded in Chicago. And he had a banjoist as one of his main instruments. And his name was Johnny Seeger, who was a virtuoso banjoist. If you listen to recordings and he played the banjo, you probably think it was a guitar because he plays these incredibly interesting chords, riffs, and runs. And it's just, he's an amazing musician. So, incredibly popular. When we get into the 1920s, we begin to see the banjo starting to fade. Right? There are a couple of reasons why it fades in comparison to the guitar. One is that banjos became very expensive. They were so popular, banjo manufacturers were selling thousands of them. They were able to raise the price because the demand was high. And one article that I read said that the cost of a banjo was 3 times the cost of a guitar. So people couldn't afford it. So people started buying guitars. We also had blues musicians in the late 1920s who were starting to make recordings, right? They were called race records. Term was recordings made specifically for African American audiences. But people like Blind Jefferson, Robert Johnson, right? A short career, but a brilliant performer. They were playing on guitars because they were less expensive. People were hearing the recordings, so the instruments people started to shift. We also have a shift in population, so that the great migration of African Americans from southern United States to the north and to the Midwest, they wanted a new start, and they wanted to leave that kind of slave background and tradition and the instrument associated with it. So there were lots of reasons why the banjo begins to become less familiar right before the Depression, which reminds me that the Depression also destroyed the guitar, the banjo. Expensive, people couldn't sell it. After that, we don't see nearly as many being manufactured. In fact, people are pawning money. They couldn't afford to keep them, so they got money from it, which is exactly how Pete Seeger, next slide, please, bought his first banjo. And this is where the banjo, once again, kind of becomes associated with white. Right? So there are 2 main strains that develop this period, which is the post-World War II period. We have a folk music revival. Pete Seeger is at the center of that activity, along with Woody Guthrie right next door. In fact, one of Pete Seeger's banjos is on display next door. It has the words written on it. You see on this banjo there. And so Pete, he begins to popularize the banjo as a folk instrument, right? So folk music. And Pete also was one of the first people to write a method for how to play the old style. So he's now teaching people to play, and he's got young people, right? This kind of long hair beatnik type, but maybe not so much long hair. People who are really interested in this folk movement, like the Kingston Trio, for example, who actually learned to play the banjo for peace. In fact, there's a link there. Do you want to see that? I don't want to make you stay too late. There's a video of Pete talking about writing his method book. Also saying,
Invite your partners to a channel and simplify.
There's YouTube, right? Let's get back.
Come on, you good workers, what news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? They say in Harlan County, they're down in the Southern Mountains who have to pick a banjo this way. But up north, I wasn't able to find anybody. There wasn't any book about it. And people asked me, how do you learn it? All I could do was say, well, you listen to records like I did. But that's a very slow way of learning, and not everybody has a good enough ear to do it. My daddy was a miner.
There's a long
During World War II, I got a letter from my father saying that I'd be willing to write an article on how the mountain banjo was played. And I got one of my fellow soldiers to take a picture of my hands in various different positions and got started writing something, and never did finish it till around 1948. The war was long over. But it sold about 100,000 copies over the years, which isn't big sales, but it's gotten around, and there must be a lot of people who learned banjo out of that book. Matter of fact, way back when it was mimeographed, I got a letter from a college student in California. He sent me his $1.59. I sent him a copy of the book. About a year later, I get a letter from him. Dear Pete, you should know we've been putting that book to hard use. I and two others have a group we call the Kingston Trio.
So that's Pete, and there's tons of videos of Pete talking about his experience. There's such a wealth of information. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost over, folks. Just bear with me. So at around the same time that Pete Seeger is writing his method book and exposing people to the sound of the mountain banjo folk music, a guy named Bill Monroe is starting to create these his band that he calls the Bluegrass Boys, Kentucky. And he's basically taking the Southern string band, which actually has its origins in African American music playing in Kentucky also, and kind of supercharging it. They're playing this virtuoso up-tempo music, very fast passages, and it's really gaining popularity. But one thing happens that turned Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys into a superstar group, and it's when he hires a man, Earl Scruggs. Right? And Earl Scruggs is the guy who sort of revolutionized banjo, because he figured out this technique of playing with three fingers that are all moving simultaneously, picking opposite instead of always downstream. And he becomes this virtuoso, and it's the sound of his band, along with the string band of Bluegrass Boys, that really becomes the character of the sound of Bluegrass, in addition to its very characteristic vocal sound. So I've got a really cool video. If you can watch just about the first 4 or 5 minutes of it. This is Bella Fleck and his wife Abigail. Bella Fleck is about plays in the scrub style, and his wife plays in the old claw.
We'll play our main banjos that we always play, and it's a marriage of people, and it's also a marriage of clawhammer style and bluegrass three-finger style, which are usually not played together. I mean, occasionally they are, but rarely, and we can't think of a duo or anyone who's made their own musical identity around that combination, which is kind of what we do with our duo.
But we weren't sure how it was going to work, you know, I mean, with our different banjo styles. I come from a banjo style that's, well, it's called the old time style, or people call clawhammer or frailing, drop film. There's a lot of different names for it. And, you know, if you're in the mountains, they'll say there's a different style in every holler. So you can't get fixed on any one. But there are certain forms that were popularized at like the Galax Fiddlers Convention. There was one style in particular from Surrey County, North Carolina. And that's who I studied with is a guy named Riley Bogus from Walkertown, North Carolina. He does a style called round. Yeah, so I have these two acrylic nails in my first middle finger, and I strike down with those two fingers. And the basic roll of a round peak technique is you strike down with your first finger on the second string. And this is the exciting part. Pull off on the second fret on the first string. That's part of the roll. And then
Without striking the string, or the way you strike the string is by pulling off.
pull it off.
You don't
You
have
put
you
your finger down.
hit it and then
Pull it off. And then strike down with the middle finger on that same string that you just pulled off on the first string. And then you pull up with your thumb on the drum string. This is what it sounds like as you get going. Then you can start to drop your finger down. Then you can start to do chord formations while still pulling off. Then you can add things like brushes. And like slides. And it's always tuned open. That's sort of a special thing about old time banjo.
where Abby is doing downstrokes with her first and second finger, mine are all up. So with the scrub style, the three-finger style, what he came together with was a very elegant way to play old-time tunes. So if you have a song like "Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms," which you roll in my sweet baby's arms, play the melody. Roll in my sweet baby's arms, play around the shack till the bell train comes back. Roll in my sweet baby's arms. And he found a way to play it where it's a surround those single melody notes with all of this.
So those are the two main styles. And again, they make it look so. But it's interesting because Del says, I cannot play the song. Right? So nobody can play finger picking either. So, but if you see banjo players today, that's mostly what you'll see. There are people who strum as well. In old jazz style, there's a plectrum. That's common today, particularly in worship. So that's really where we are in terms of the history of Bell Effect. He performed it years ago, so he's currently an active musician. There are also Black musicians who are sort of reviving the old string band tradition. So if you're familiar with groups like the Carolina Chocolate Drops, who are broken up now, but they really were built on that old string tradition. Leanne Giddens, the banjo fiddler and singer from that band, she plays a plantation. So let's skip to the last slide because I've already taken you beyond where we're supposed to. But I just want to leave you with this final thought. It can be argued that the banjo is justifiably described as the American instrument, though this description is laden with an excess of musical and cultural baggage. As an object, the banjo claims a long and complex lineage derived from far-flung parts of the world, but it's uniquely a manifestation of experiences in the New World. The horrific legacy of slavery lies at the very creation of the banjo, but so does the resilience and resourcefulness of the people who were forced to contend with its travail. The sound of the banjo was recognized and admired by white teens in the US at an early stage of its development. The attraction to its sounds led to it playing a central role in what is recognized as the most American form of popular entertainment, minstrelship. These shows, despite their overtly racist and offensive content, laid the foundation for popular entertainment to this day, establishing a style of comedy, musical variety show, and vernacular that is part of vocabulary. From that time on, following emancipation, Black musicians have been largely responsible for the creation of many of the distinctive musical styles that have become synonymous with American popular culture. Whether it's ragtime, the blues, jazz, swing, R&B, country, rock and roll, soul, funk, and rap. Curiously, a thread common in the history of American popular culture has been the decline of the Africanization of white America through the incorporation of Black music and dance into mainstream white society. It may be that this long tradition of ostensibly rejecting Black culture, while consistently attracted to and absorbing its features, began with the banjo and was associated.
So in blues musicians, acoustic players, early acoustic players, they could make their guitars kind of sound like a human voice, but you can't do that with a banjo.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So one of the most characteristic sounds of sort of the banjo and plantation style banjo is it's very dry quality, right? It doesn't have that singing, sustained quality. And that's actually one of the things that happens in the modification of the banjo is its increased ability to play a kind of legato. But you're exactly right. One of the things about the guitar is that it does produce that kind of sustained. So, and that's, again, it kind of plays into that sense of like, what is the African sound versus what is the European sound? Because African instruments tend to be jangly and noisy and have vibrating parts to them, and string instruments have this very quick decay to the sound, percussive quality. And Pete Seeger actually refers to the banjo as a rhythm instrument. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, rhythm. Yes. Hang on. Go ahead.
I've heard that the shapes on the side of the neck from the plantation stuff and indicate like where the frets would be, or specific notes are. Have you seen anything like that?
I haven't seen that in terms of like the old plantation banjos. I saw someone talking about the banjo and saying that they started putting frets on them and shipped them out to people. That some people actually filed the frets on because they didn't want. So sort of the other way around, but I mean, it makes kind of sense, right? Because people do want to know where to stop the string in terms of pitch, but I can't confirm or deny.
Just a question about stylistic use. These days, and even from the early part of the 20th century, the banjo became kind of a lead instrument. So plucking and things like that was something you actually sort of, at least in segments, lead part of whatever the competition was. It seems like the earlier primitive format be more of like, okay, more of a background.
Not a melodic instrument.
Yeah, and I mean, is that correct, or is there any differentiation of involved now?
Again, I'm not sure I can definitively answer that question, but from what I've heard, recordings of the African, like the Conte instrument, and they're played as a melodic instrument without singing, right? So not just to accompany. So it does accompany the singing, but it also is played melodically. So it can function either way. When you listen to the bluegrass banjo, clearly it has a strong melodic component. When you listen to the mountain banjo, it's clearly. So, you know, depending upon the different traditions.
So those are all, they have existed all the way back to North.
Yes. Seeing no other objections. Thank you again, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate having such an interested and full house. And, enjoy the rest of the exhibit. It's actually really beautiful. Have a good weekend.